Welcome to the Bricker and Speer podcast. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm glad to be back in conversation with Darrell Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Global Public Affairs, about the key developments and trends shaping Canadian politics. Today, we'll cover the ongoing trade war with the Trump administration, Mark Carney's decisive victory in the Liberal leadership race, and what happens next in Canadian politics. Darrell, thanks as always for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Sean.
Sarah, I want to start with the Liberal leadership outcome. Of course, the party members voted over the weekend and overwhelmingly chose Mark Carney to lead the party and in turn to become Canada's next prime minister. Let me ask a two-part question. First, uh, were you surprised by the decisive outcome? And second, how do you interpret what it means for the Liberal Party itself and the forthcoming Carney government?
You and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and we made a couple of predictions, and this was one of them.
Yes.
So obviously, I'm not surprised, and I think that the real tells were the behavior of the Liberal caucus and cabinet pretty much told you that they knew what
Yes.
they wanted and what was going to happen.
Yes.
A very low turnout election, hardly was it 140 or 180,000 people voted, something like that. Or voted for Carney, or voted in the entire thing. I mean, it was really not very heavy,
Yes.
but nonetheless, this is the will of the Liberal Party, and they got the result that they wanted.
Should we interpret anything about Carney's decisive win? Is this a case, Darrell, of the so-called blue liberals pulling the party back to the center, or would it be a stretch to try to make those types of judgments out of the leadership race?
It would be a stretch to make those judgments out of this leadership race. Basically, what it was the apparatchik that were around Justin Trudeau unifying behind one particular candidate. It became obvious to everybody else, so they just piled on. I mean, the former Minister of Finance, who actually triggered the downfall of the Prime Minister, you know, basically got together a good birthday party in the Burger King party room. I mean, that was about it, and which is really shocking, but it just shows you, people who are in the Liberal Party can look at a poll. The Liberal Party is about power and about obtaining power and using that power to achieve the Liberal Party's ends. And they saw him as the best runner and they picked him.
Yeah, well, I want to take up that point because I'll admit that this represents a case of an error judgment on my part. I had taken for granted, Darrell, that over the past decade, the Liberal Party had transformed itself, which is to say, it became less of the pragmatic, power-focused party that had dominated 20th century politics in Canada and had become a more of an ideological party committed to the goals of advancing progressive political ends. And it seems to me what we saw over the course of this race, including Carney disavowing key parts of the Trudeau government's progressive agenda, including but not limited to the carbon caps, carbon tax, and the capital gains tax increase, a sign that liberals are still fundamentally, as you put it, oriented towards power and retaining power.
Well, actually, I think the Trudeau version of the Liberal Party was also a very power-oriented version of the Liberals, as the Liberals have been through Canadian history. They saw their strategy going back to Justin Trudeau in 2015 as collapsing the NDP by moving left, which they did, and they won a majority in 2015 as a result, and they survived and basically governed with the NDP and after 2019 and after 2021. So you can look at that as being ideological, but it was pragmatically ideological. Not
Yeah.
that they didn't believe what they were doing, but they also knew that the way to success was to collapse the progressive vote behind one option. And that was
Yes.
going to be their best chance to win. So I think, you can decide whether it was the tail or the donkey, but
Yeah.
I think they were sincere in their views in terms of public policy, but they also knew that it would have a strong electoral appeal.
So let's look forward now. If you were advising Mark Carney, not necessarily about the election, we'll come to that, but even in the coming days, what are some of the key decisions that he has to make, and how should he think about them as he positions himself for an eventual election campaign?
Well, the simplest possible campaign that you could launch is the one that Mark Carney can run. He's going to build on the momentum from his win of the Liberal leadership, and he's got one big thing that works for him, and that is that he is going to go after Pierre Poilievre and make him into a mini Trump. And it is interesting. We put out a poll. I think you and I don't think we discussed it on our last call, but it was really instructive. So we went through kind of the CV points of Mark Carney.
Yes.
He's a person who's best able to deal with Donald Trump. He's a person who's best able to bring the Canadian Team Canada together. He's also the best person to come up with policies that would mitigate some of the effects of what the U.S. is doing. Except he wasn't. In fact, on all three of those items, Pierre Poilievre actually led. The one thing that Mark Carney led on was that he was seen as the of the two major party leaders much less likely to roll over for Donald Trump.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that there's a fair number of people in the media who are in the intelligentsia in Canada who are reading into Mark Carney what they think Canadians are thinking, but I don't know that they're either aware of who he is in that respect, or even necessarily value those particular items. What they're really more concerned about is Pierre Poilievre and potentially being somebody who is too close to Trump in terms of not necessarily his personal affiliations or anything like that, but seen as somebody who's kind of reflective of what Donald Trump is about. And can
Yes.
you trust somebody like that to represent Canada's interest in negotiations? Fair or unfair, that's just kind of what it is. The other thing that Mark Carney has to do is just clearly distance himself from the Liberal administration, the previous Liberal administration. Well, I think events have done that for him. And in fact, I think that he has to worry less about that than I think punditry would suggest. People have moved into the here and now and the near-term future, and they're really looking at that as the policy agenda, as opposed to the things that happened in the past. And as a result, it puts him in a position where he is, in just about every poll you look at right now, at least pretty close to tied with the Conservatives. We had him slightly ahead. We might see other polls that'll have him slightly ahead or slightly behind, but definitely has got the Liberal Party back in the game.
Yeah, well, I want to take up a few things you said there, because it seems to me, in the immediate term, some of the questions, some of the choices before him are quite tactical, and one of the issues at the backdrop of those decisions is the extent to which a Carney-led government represents "quote unquote" change. This week, of course, he appointed former Trudeau-era cabinet minister Marco Mendicino as his chief of staff. By the time this is released, we may even have more information about how he'll populate a cabinet. To what extent, in your mind, Darrell, is it imperative for him to bring different faces into his cabinet? Or, as you say, are those types of arguments overstating things in your mind?
I think people get into a lot of inside baseball. Nobody in Canada, other than Mark Mendicino's family and a few people who watch politics, know who Mark Mendicino is. Yeah, I'm sure he's a lovely person, but he's not somebody that walks down the street and gets stopped constantly saying, "Hey, are you Mark Mendicino?" It doesn't happen.
Yes, well
This is
said.
inside politics in Ottawa. Actually, my view of where Carney is right now is his campaign is the act of governing. It's showing that he can govern well,
Yes.
and that he can deal with the emergencies that Canada is going through are his best campaign. From what we've seen from Mark Carney so far, he's not an impressive politician. He's not somebody who can speak effectively in sound bites. He's not somebody who can whip up a crowd. He's not somebody who exudes a level of personal charisma and warmth the way that Justin Trudeau did. So his strong suit is being able to say, "I'm actually who I said I was, and others say about me," and that's a person who's reasonable, mature, can come up with the best outcomes for Canada in very difficult circumstances, and he will govern the country, maybe not inspirationally, but well.
Yeah, I take your point, and we'll come to some of those bigger themes in a minute. But if I could just put it to you directly, in a world where Mark Carney essentially brings back the Trudeau cabinet, including some polarizing figures like former Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault. To what extent does that open the door to the Conservatives to essentially make the argument that the captain has changed, but everyone else on the boat is essentially the same, and as such, you're likely to get the same outcomes?
And that is exactly what the conservatives will do, because what they want to do is they want to run against Justin Trudeau, not Mark Carney.
Yes. Yes.
So anything that gives them the opportunity to do that, they will take advantage of. The question is, at the moment, does it matter?
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
Does it matter? And what we're seeing in the polling, it matters for, 37, 38% of the population, but that's the same number that it actually doesn't matter for who are prepared
Yes.
to vote for the Liberal Party. So is it enough to sink his ship? No. I think the thing that really is the vulnerability for Mark Carney is actually Mark Carney.
Mark Carney. And just to take up that point, and I think what you mean is the extent to which he's an unknown quantity as a politician. How does he hold up to the rigor and scrutiny of a multi-week campaign? Is there anything, Mark, Darrell, that you've seen either from the leadership race or Carney's track record that gives us any insight about that?
Yeah, I think he's going to have difficulty cutting through with
Hmm.
Canadians to give them the level of connected confidence that they need to put them at ease. He's a guy who you can tell does great boardroom.
Hmm.
There's a lot of hand steeples, you know, very thoughtful, but his explanations are long.
Yes.
And you saw it in his answer on Brookfield, right? And your listeners will know because they obviously watch politics. That's why they're watching this podcast. I guess I should say our rather than just your,
Yes.
um,
Yes.
but they will know chapter and verse what all of that means. But the answer that Mark Carney gave to that question was just so disappointing because it was an opportunity to break free from that tradition that you saw develop over the space of the last decade with the Trudeau liberals, which was that they could never actually confront the idea that they might have been wrong or that something was questionable. So his answer was not, if I had to do that over again, maybe I wouldn't. But at the time, I wasn't really considering that I was going to be running for the leadership of the Liberal Party. And you know what? I should have probably done something different. And yeah, I'm only human. I was in that job, and that's what I was doing at the time. I wasn't thinking of running for the leadership of the Liberal Party. That. But by the way, also somewhat questionable because the guy's probably pined for it for his entire life. But anyway, at least it's a kind of answer that people could engage with, rather than maybe I wasn't precise enough,
Hmm.
which sounds to me like you basically saying to somebody, "You're too stupid. I didn't make this simple enough," which
Yeah.
is very too reminiscent of some people experience things differently.
Yeah.
Maybe this is a learning experience for us all. All these things that were done that and then after that, if you're going to question me, you must be a racist, misogynist, whatever it is that bad motives would justify you actually asking Justin Trudeau questions about why he did what he did. And boy, that was a real problem. Yes, there's the problem with the jobs, but it's the presentation and the skirting around the issue that really is something that people learn to loathe about Justin Trudeau. And here's this guy walking right into the same type of situation. I think this could be a moment that comes back if we remember this. If Mark Carney does find himself sliding in the future, that we'll point back to saying that was an interesting tell about why he was going to run into trouble.
Hmm. That's interesting. Just in parentheses, to put together a couple of points that you've made so far is that counterintuitively, one of his strengths is that he is not perceived as a kind of traditional politician. But in a way, his answer to that question felt very political and may, as you outline, do harm to this idea that there's something different about him that speaks to the moment we're in. I just have a couple of other questions
Well, can we
about
just
Carney.
before you
Please,
get to
yeah,
that, uh,
please.
actually, just to maybe summarize it and add a little bit of a nuance to this, it's actually not that it summarizes him as a politician; it summarizes him as Trudeau-like.
Hmm.
This is the kind of
Interesting.
answer you would get from Justin Trudeau, right?
Interesting.
It's not like, yes, no, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it or whatever. It's, no, I wasn't precise enough, which
Hmm.
means that you're too dumb to understand what I meant.
Yeah.
Now, he didn't mean it that way, obviously. He was just saying maybe I should have been clearer about it, but the way it comes across, it's not there's a lacking in sincerity in
Yeah.
this, a
Yeah.
lacking in authenticity in the way he approached it. And if he does that through the course of this campaign, it will be a difficult time for him.
Two more questions about Carney, and then we'll look ahead to some bigger questions, including how to understand what's played out since we last spoke, vis-a-vis the Trump administration. First on Carney, um, I, like me, you've probably heard speculation that he is reaching out to some quote unquote high profile candidates, former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, former BC Premier Christy Clark, and others who would comprise what it's been characterized to me as a wartime cabinet. Do you think something like that would play into Carney's strengths and resonate with Canadians?
Yeah, I think it would. I think any time that a government, I think it worked for Justin Trudeau that he was able to bring in people like Bill Morneau and Chrystia Freeland and others into his government. It says, if you think you have questions about this person, look at the quality of the individuals who are prepared to come and serve with him in this government, in a dire moment in Canadian history. Yeah, actually, I think it would reflect rather well on him.
Hmm. And finally, on Carney, uh, similarly, as you know, there's a ton of expectation that by the time we speak next, we will be into a federal election campaign that as early as the week of March 17th. At some point, he will advise the Governor General to dissolve Parliament, and off we'll go. Um, do you doubt that choice as a matter of politics at all, or are you in implicit agreement with Carney and his people that it's in his interest and the interest of the Liberal Party to call election before Parliament's return, set to return the week of March 24th?
Well, there's so many kind of technical things that go along with this question. Speech from the throne, whether he needs names a cabinet. There's a whole bunch of process related things that go
Yes,
along with it that might make it necessary just because it would be too difficult to deal with all of the
yes,
elements of
yes.
trying to bring it together. But if you could just have a kind of neutral conversation about this, I think that there's also an argument for him to continue.
Hmm.
And the argument would be, as I said before, his best campaign is the act of governing.
Yeah,
It's the thing where he can demonstrate the strength that he claims, and it's
yeah,
something that Pierre Poilievre cannot do.
yeah,
So there's I think maybe a counterfactual or maybe a thought experiment that you could do that suggests that there's at least an argument to have over this.
yeah,
But and by the way, the NDP are not going to vote him down. He could, I think I said to you the last time, they could get Jagmeet Singh for the price of a Happy Meal. Might even
yes.
just be the kids, the not even get the toy with it. I mean, just I mean, they're just going to roll over for them right now. Their numbers are terrible. So there's you could possibly do it, but there may be so many complications it just doesn't make it practical, and they might as well go to the people. They've got a bit of momentum. Although the thing is on this, Sean, not a lot. I mean, there's a new poll I saw today that basically has them tied, and it's like, yeah, that's not a lot of momentum. I mean, yes, they've closed the gap and the rest of it, but the game is not to tie the Tories. The game is to beat them and to win
Yeah.
a majority, and we're not there.
Yeah, yeah, we'll move on, but let me just say I'm glad that you reflected that line of thinking, Darrell, because I'm kind of inclined to agree that the conventional wisdom that it's self-evidently in Carney's interest to go right away strikes me as a bit unnuanced. That although there are a bunch of, as you say, procedural or tactical reasons why that may make sense, including, of course, the fact that should he bring Parliament back, it would expose the fact that he himself is not in the Parliament. that there are benefits associated with leading a government, including the potential that he could solve some of these issues with the Trump administration and go into an election campaign with a really impressive track record, as opposed to simply litigating who's best placed to manage ongoing discussions with the administration. But anyway, let's move on.
Can I just add
Um,
one more point before you move on
please,
to that? Sorry, Sean.
yeah,
It's also, he's not a very good politician.
yes,
We've got enough experience with him now. I mean, they're playing peekaboo with him, with
yes,
the press.
yes,
This is not somebody who is confident on his skates.
yes,
You can just see it. And he's not used to dealing with somebody like a Pierre Polyev who's going to stand up and say, I just disagree with you, but you're a jerk and you're evil. That
yes,
like he's people don't do that in Mark Carney's life. They've never done that. And so
yes,
how is he going to deal with that? We haven't seen that yet. Now, probably they're rehearsing it.
yes,
They're trying to get ready. I'm wondering who they're going to have play Pierre Polyev in the debates,
yes,
debate preps, and all the rest of it. But until you actually face it, and Polyev is very, very, very annoying, and
yes.
particularly for somebody who's smart and used to being respected like Mark
But
Carney.
Mark
So
Carney.
so this idea that you should rush into an election because this guy is, absolutely assured of becoming prime minister. There's a lot happens in a campaign, and we haven't seen him deal with it, and it's not his natural environment.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, I'm about to ask you a question that I didn't intend to ask you, and it feels a bit presumptive because we haven't even kicked off an election campaign. But it speaks to something you mentioned earlier, which is at present, it's likely the two parties are roughly tied. One might be ahead by a point or two. It's not worth getting into those finer details. But all things being equal, if those numbers hold, we'll likely have a minority government of one shape or the other. In the event it was a conservative minority, Darrell, uh, and the liberals and the New Democrats came together to propose to the governor general that they ought to govern rather than the conservatives, even though the conservatives had won uh, more seats, even if it's just on the margins. Do you have a sense, as someone who's been in the field polling for years, even decades, how Canadians would instinctively respond to that kind of dynamic?
It would be unusual, and we have one example in which this was the case. And we'd have to look at the exact structure of what that government would look like. So if it's the Liberals and the NDP would have a minority rather than a majority, but they would have slightly more seats than the Conservatives, which
Yes,
would mean that they'd actually have to either govern with the support of the Bloc or the Conservative Party voting with them on some particular policies and doing it on a vote by vote basis, is Stephen Harper in 2008.
yes,
And we saw what happened when Stéphane Dion tried to bring together a coalition of the willing, including the Bloc, to prevent the
yes,
evil Stephen Harper from governing. Canadians went nuts,
yeah,
and the whole thing fell apart in no time.
yeah,
So that's the most recent experience that we've had. But I don't think Stephen Harper, the degree of concern about him, since he'd already kind of been around for a bit of time. After in 2006, he'd already been around for a bit of time. People weren't
yes,
as they were more used to him than they would be used to Pierre Polyev.
yes,
So, it'd be interesting to see if it could happen. But the key for the Liberals and the NDP, in order to be able to continue what has basically been a Liberal NDP administration since 2019, is the seats have to add up to a majority in the House. If they
yeah,
don't, then even that minority becomes more difficult. And then at that stage, if the Conservatives, if they're leading them by, say, 10 seats or 15 seats, it's a pretty difficult moral argument to make that they shouldn't be able to govern, or at least
yeah.
try.
Yeah, I don't want to sound alarmist, and we should move on because there's more immediate threats facing the country. But I am a bit concerned about that scenario, Darrell, especially given that the Conservatives have won the popular vote now in successive elections, and there's really been no momentum or movement in the country to doubt our election process or question our election system. Canadians, particularly in the western part of the country, have participated in our democracy, and the outcome hasn't been what they hope for, generally speaking. But in an event where they elect conservatives with the most seats in parliament, not a majority, but a plurality, and we see the other parties effectively aim to undo that outcome by asking the governor general for a first chance to test the confidence of the House. I worry a bit about how that would manifest itself across the country. Would it lead to increasing skepticism about our electoral and political system, or would it, at the risk of stretching this as even further, would it cause others to start to look at, for instance, the virtues of becoming the 51st state?
Yeah, we are at a breaking point in this country. There's a number of issues that really are existential, just as you've described it. And I think the three major parties getting together, excluding the Conservative Party, in order to govern in an election in which they didn't win, is essentially running with nitroglycerin.
Yeah.
The potential that it could blow up in their faces is there, and it ended up falling apart back in 2008. And if it would have held together, what would have been the reaction of Canadians? It's something that we haven't had to contemplate in a modern era or ever, to be honest.
Yes. Just on you've been so generous with your time. I'll let you get to the various things that have brought you to Europe in a moment. But just staying on the subject of national unity, in the recent days, we've seen some speculation that the Trump administration may ultimately exempt oil and gas exports altogether from tariffs, or at least subject them to a lower tariff than a generalized one for other Canadian exports. And you're seeing some calls in different parts of the country for the federal government in Canada to seize on this as an opportunity to impose an export tax on oil and gas exports, or curtail production, or undertake other policies in the means of effectively using oil and gas exports as leverage vis-a-vis the Trump administration. Do you have any reflections, Darrell, on the political implications of that type of action, and what it may mean for tensions across the country?
It's possible that it can be done, but doing it outside of the support of the governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan is very, very difficult. Very
Mhm.
difficult. And the ability, and who knows what the total ability of the government to retaliate, the Alberta
Yes.
government to retaliate. I don't know. Maybe they stop transfer payments. Maybe they stop. Who knows what it is that they stop. I know they don't hold the money themselves and all the rest of it. But I mean
Yes.
their ability to retaliate is significant, and this would be a fundamental challenge for any prime minister that came into power. If Pierre
Yes.
Poilievre was in a similar circumstance, even if people overwhelmingly voted for Pierre Poilievre, if he decided that he was going to impose oil and gas export tax, and it was against the will of Premier Smith and Premier Moe, he'd probably face similar types of ire. So yeah, the national unity crisis in Canada these days is no longer Quebec. The
Yeah.
national unity crisis in Canada is the oil producing provinces.
Yeah, just to stay on this point, again, at the risk of sounding alarmist, I wonder if this issue may shift from being conceptual to quite practical in the coming days and weeks. You could see a world, Darrell, where in the event a Carney-led government signaled it was considering such a policy, or even enacted one, there'd be an instinct on the part of conservatives to impose it, in large part because of the party's support in Western Canada. But given the salience of the Canada-U.S. relationship across other parts of the country, and as you say, some of the inherent skepticism about Poilievre's commitment to quote unquote stand up for Canada, one wonders if it wouldn't be in the Liberals' interest in a way to precipitate that kind of choice on the part of on the part of the Conservatives, and create a political dynamic that essentially kind of trades off Alberta for other parts, voters in other parts of the country. What do you think about that hypothetical scenario?
Well, I expect there are people wargaming this right now, but I don't think that there's any way that Pierre Poilievre is going to go against the province of Alberta and the province of Saskatchewan.
Yes,
And I think the better argument would be one made back about how this would, whatever was done in terms of a Canadian approach, he'd be able to bring together all of the provinces in a way that they would
yes,
support retaliating back against the Americans. If the Liberals play that game, I mean, it just reads, it just feeds into the fear that people have about the intentions of a new political leader, and he's just dropping right back into the same position that Justin Trudeau was in, and that's what people wanted to change away from. Remember, Mark Carney's his commitment is he's the one who's able to bring people together and
yes,
create a Team Canada approach to effectively deal with the challenge that we're receiving from the United States, and it starts in many ways with Alberta and Saskatchewan because for people who are listening here today, I mean the auto industry, hydroelectric transfers, anything else that you can think about in terms of exports between Canada and the United States pale in significance to oil and gas exports. I
yes,
mean, so to go after one province or two provinces in particular that in which this is their entire economy, basically, you're playing with fire.
yeah, yeah. Let's wrap up with a final question. We've spent a lot of time talking about Mark Carney and the Liberals. We've talked a bit about national unity questions. Where do things currently stand for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives in your mind, Darrell? What are they doing right, and what are they doing wrong to meet the moment and ultimately compete successfully in a forthcoming election?
Honestly, there's very little they could have done in this current environment. It was, when Justin Trudeau left, obviously it was going to create an opportunity for somebody else to come in and create some change, or at least a change in, look and feel for the Liberal Party, so people could reconsider them. It happened with Kim Campbell, it happened with Jean Chrétien, it happened with John. Every time a party changes, people tend to get a look and they get interested. And after that, I mean, you can be very critical of Polyev and his team and say, well, they should have pivoted, whatever that means, to
Yes,
whatever, the new environment is. But, you've been branding yourself in a certain way for the space of the last 2 years. It's difficult to just say, okay, that stuff doesn't matter and move on to whatever the new thing is. And nobody's really even sure what the new thing is until Donald
yes,
Trump does what he does. And then if you're the leader of the opposition, how do you find a place in this? I mean,
yes. Well
you've
said.
got the prime minister who's going to be the one who's obviously going to get the most attention, but the other space that's available for other voices is being completely filled up by the premiers, particularly
Yes,
people like Premier Ford. So, where is it that Pierre Poilievre can find himself into this discussion? The only thing that he can really do is to say, for those of you who've worried about whether or not I'd roll over for Donald Trump, I can assure you I won't, and then provide examples as to why that would be the case, or promises that you would make about how you would deal with the situation. I mean, you can do that, but I don't know that anybody's really going to be listening at this stage of the game. So their best effort is really not focusing on themselves right now. It's focusing on the man of the moment, Mark Carney, and trying to define him in a way that he doesn't want to be defined.
yeah.
And you can see that that's exactly what they're doing. Has it worked at this point? Well, the Liberals haven't taken off as much as they could be through the course of a leadership campaign. So maybe it's happening. Maybe they're creating some anticipatory elements there that people are going to be checking about whether or not he really does represent change. Maybe they're going to have questions about who he is and what he values that are going to be raised by the Conservatives. That it's all the seeds are being planted. Whether or not they'll actually lead to anything that'll be significant growth in the springtime, who knows? But at this stage of the game, I think they're doing what they can do in this current environment. I wouldn't be too critical, but they've got to go hard at Carney because, as we've discussed before, the Conservatives are still, I would say, on the ballot perceived as the most legitimate change, the people most representing the biggest change from the previous administration, and all the Liberals have is the promise of one person. The campaign's obvious.
That's precisely, Darrell, the type of dispassionate and thoughtful analysis we've come to expect from you. Thank you for engaging my hypothetical questions, especially after having spent a lot of time in an airplane. I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to catching up soon.
Thanks a lot, Sean.